Hello, beautiful community. We're going to have a gentler and slower time together that is only for those who want to indulge and sit along for probably as long as half an hour, because we're going to read an article together that criticizes the late Mr. Navalny for being a Russian nationalist. And we're not going to do this to learn about Navalny, because this is not a Let's Learn Facts About Russia channel. We're going to focus on ourselves, how we think about politics, and insofar as this is going to be about Russia at all, it's going to be about Western response and how we think of the war in general and what social issues arise either that way or via our concerns about our democracy. Is that what you want? If it's what you want, then come along and we'll start. And we'll read a piece by Michel that appeared in Foreign Policy and got obliterated by Russia experts, including by Robert Horvath on Twitter, who made several factual and conceptual objections. But I think there were some people in the community who wanted me to read this piece. And we'll do it, but we've got to understand that what we're going to do is we're going to put ourselves first, rather than getting facts about Navalny or getting facts about Russia. Right. What you've got to understand before we start reading is that experts, or people who are aspiring to be experts, have a certain kind of sacredness to them. And that is because the institution of expertise, in particular academic expertise, but not just academic expertise, is an absolutely central counter-majoritarian institution in a democracy. A society without academics and experts is almost like a society without courts. You don't have a democracy if you lose these people. And that creates a kind of double ethic for experts. On the one hand, experts should be bloody self-righteous and say, without me you have got nothing, because without me you don't have truthfulness, and without truthfulness you don't have democracy. One half. But the other half is, for goodness sake, we're in the biggest crisis of trust in our society since 1848, trust in institutions, and I've got to stay in my lane. I should not BS, because if I BS, the costs of that are probably 5 to 10x what they would have been if I BS'd in 1998. Because when I BS today, that undermines trust in this central democratic institution. Okay, let's start. So, Michel, I think he's got a book out this year called Foreign Agents, and American Kleptocracy is a book of his from a few years ago. I've read neither. And so let me then just add, if you indulge me, one last qualifier. If I take a donut, and I like a donut, or I dislike a donut, from a fantastic new bakery, it's possible that the donut I have, right, should be evaluated very differently to the 11 other donuts available from that shop. It's possible that the 11 others are the same in quality. It's possible they're of a much higher quality or a much lower quality. So this needn't be said, but because we are in this horrible set of, mental and fact bubbles on the internet, and we're so polarized against each other, we're drawn to think that if somebody praises someone for one thing, they're praising them for everything. It's a terrible problem we're algorithmically locked into. Let's start. The past 2 weeks have seen an outpouring of both grief and tributes following the death of the Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny. And rightly so. Navalny's death in a Siberian gulag effectively snuffed out what many viewed as the clearest path to Russia's eventual democratization. No one had fooled themselves that Navalny would somehow win Russia's upcoming election, with Putin's re-election all but confirmed. But there were plenty, especially in the West, who still viewed Navalny as a figure akin to Nelson Mandela, emerging from a lengthy prison tenure to lead his nation into a bright democratic future. Now that dream is dead, and any potential for Russia's eventual democratization appears even more distant and even less likely. But while Russia's remaining opposition continues to, as in I've decided I've got no comment yet, but while Russia's remaining opposition continues to look for new strategies to employ in the wake of Navalny's death, one clear lesson has hopefully emerged for those in the West. It is too risky to place all hopes of a nation's eventual democratization on a single person. Now, I'm going to be gentle. I don't entirely recognize that. What I recognize is a lack of an account of agency in the West of how change in Russia might happen. So a real tendency to revert to magical thinking about how change might happen in the Russian space, because we're so bad at looking at the mechanics of it. And we tried to do that a little bit actually in the video on the main channel a couple of weeks ago about the issue of the breakup of Russia, what kind of possibility that is, and what thoughts are relevant to considering that possibility. But I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced that in the West there is that kind of elevation of Mr. Navalny as a solitary hope we pin ourselves on, embodied in the career of a single individual. But I won't press this too much. It's not just that a singular figure, such as Mr. Navalny, can be killed. It's also that for as much bravery as Navalny exhibited, and to be honest, and to be clear, Navalny illustrated more bravery than most people will ever know, there were clear faults and frailties within his politics. While Navalny arguably proved to be Putin's most able political opponent, he also shared many of the same revanchist tendencies that propelled Russia into Ukraine in the first place, a reality that too many in the West preferred to ignore or downplay. He shared many of the same revanchist tendencies that propelled Russia into Ukraine in the first place. I mean, the rough story with Navalny is that he said some dumb nationalist nonsense, was a bit offensive and xenophobic, in good part because he was playing politics and trying to explore how to build coalitions. Tried to learn actually by looking at the Ukrainian experience. And then he sort of mostly snapped out of that and then spent and apologized for some of it, not for enough of it. And then he spent the rest of his career politicizing the Russian space, undoubtedly a huge tick there, but then there's a question mark over whether Navalny managed to offer a concrete alternative, enough of an alternative vision for Russia. But he shared many of the same revanchist tendencies that propelled Russia into Ukraine. I mean, he only recently stated, we'll get into this, I presume, as the article goes on, but because I've skimmed it, but I haven't read it in its entirety. But Navalny condemned the annexation of Crimea on the spot, while equivocating about the dimension of Crimea's return. And he only came out in about 2023 saying, no negotiation, Ukraine's 1991 borders, and now please, not we'll work toward that, which was his position in 2014. But, I mean, he shared many of the same revanchist tendencies that propelled Russia. That is so wildly off any sense of proportion that, depending on what's said later in this article, I would say this is not just wrong, but really borders on being deceptive. But it is a reality that can no longer be overlooked. After all, it is Russian nationalism that has unleashed Europe's most destructive conflict since the Second World War and pushed the world closer to potential nuclear conflict than anything in decades. Let's try this sentence again because I lost it. After all, if it is Russian nationalism that did all this horrible stuff, which it has done, or Russian whatever, imperialism, whatever we want to say, then anyone exhibiting these tendencies, as Navalny did for years, must be treated cautiously. And if the clearest lesson from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that Western interlocutors need to listen more, far more, to warnings and analyses from former Russian colonies, then it's long past time to listen to what Ukrainians have been saying about Navalny and other leading lights of Russian anti-Putin opposition. Well, there are tens of millions of Ukrainians. Some Ukrainians are right-wing, conservative. Some Ukrainians are left-wing. Some Ukrainians are liberal. There are many other categories of Ukrainians, and they do have different views. In general, there is a tendency to be very skeptical of Mr. Navalny in Ukraine and dislike his statements. But what I would say is that there is an important distinction that is slid over. Are we listening to Ukrainians to understand the importance of their fight and their challenge, or are we listening to Ukrainians for a general account of the roots of that challenge and how to fix it, not just in respect of what we should do toward Ukraine, but what we should do toward Russia? And that's a grey distinction on the one hand, but on the other hand, it isn't, in the sense that Ukrainians can absolutely tell us, for goodness sake, stop this nightmarish, violent imperialism coming over our territory, and by the way, it might come to yours later if you don't stop it. But it's not the same thing to then listen to Ukrainians about how the Russian space should be politicized, right? Because when Ukrainians say, and again, we're only generalizing about the tendencies of discourse on social media, and very cautiously generalizing beyond about a kind of a skepticism of Navalny in Ukraine. But when you get specifically to talking about politicizing the Russian space, the Ukrainian position that Navalny is either irrelevant or is rather like Putin is apolitical. If that's the Ukrainian position, it's an apolitical position. And of course, nothing legal about it, because you can say, well, this horrific imperial mania has come over my way. And then there is this guy, I don't even care to listen to him anymore, but there is this guy, he talked about sandwiches, he talked about not giving Crimea back straight away. And then if you go back earlier, I mean, he hasn't been saying this stuff more recently, he's apologized for some of it, but he was saying some terrible things about Georgia, about the hell with this guy, go away. Go away. I thought this guy can go and he can go away. I don't like this guy. Nothing wrong with that. As an expressive political reaction, but of course, if you think that Putin's chief political opponent on the Russian space isn't a useful project for anybody who is interested in politicizing the Russian space, you're crazy, right? You're utterly crazy. So if by the Ukrainian position, Casey means the sophisticated positions of many Ukrainians on Navalny, then there's nothing to look for there, that they have a nuanced view. But if he means the Twitter activist position on Navalny, then that's just not a political position. It's not a political position to say Mr. Navalny is completely irrelevant and the West should not comply with that position. And this is actually one of the challenges with insufficient support for Ukraine and not having a strategy to help Ukraine push back this brutal imperialist violence that's coming their way. And we don't have as much leverage to say to Ukrainians, well, hey guys, do you want to join us in a conversation about politicizing the Russian and the Belarusian space? And we can talk about how to generate conflict there and so on. We have less leverage that way because we're not supporting them enough. Now, I'm sure this will be recirculated in the piece, so let's go on. All of this points to one clear takeaway from the past few weeks. With Navalny's death, the time has come for the West to move beyond the idea that some Mandela-type figure will emerge in Russia. Well, this is the second time this one-man show, being something you should be skeptical of, is mentioned. But one-man show is actually a little distinct from questions of malign nationalism. It's not entirely the same thing, but okay. Instead of placing its hopes in a singular future leader, the West will be far better served by facing the threats of Russian irredentism head-on and finally focusing on eliminating Russian nationalism as a political force once and for all. So when we're facing a crisis of trust, there's also a pressure on editors to get it right and to be on the ball about not letting things be written that aren't sufficiently clear. And I mean, the level of clarity of that statement is spectacularly low. Certainly in recent American history, the greatest person doing a job like this was reading the pieces of important experts and commentators, or Bob Silvers at the New York Review of Books. And he died about 6-7 years ago. And there's no way he lets this sentence pass. Because it's a highly, highly embarrassing sentence. One of the last PhD students that someone who's a friend of Bob's supervised, Isaiah Berlin, was Yuli Tamir. And Yuli wrote a book that came out with that PhD, with that doctorate, called Liberal Nationalism. And it was about benign forms of nationalism. So there are malign and there are benign forms of nationalism, and there are different forms of benign and different forms of malign nationalism. And yes, we're not in an academic seminar. We're writing a foreign policy piece here. We're editing and reading a foreign policy piece here. But we need that distinction. It's just not meaningful to say Russian nationalism. Let me be absolutely clear. Patriotism is an enormously important political virtue for any transformative purpose. It is out of patriotic sentiment that the United States arises as a country, and when US democracy is in trouble, or when US does things that are very troubling, like the Iraq War, How do you deal with it as Americans? Well, what you begin to say is, this is not us. We love our country. This is not us. If this is happening, it means that something has gone wrong with our nation's project. And we've got to fix it, because this is about us. So there's a love of country, and there is a sense of solidarity around that, a sense of responsibility around that, and then a sense of feeling shame about one's national project having gone off the rails. So what I want to say is that no social change happens without virtually no significant social change in the country happens without patriotism to some extent driving it. So the idea that you could abstract that out is crazy. And at the moment, one of the biggest faults of the Russian opposition, and here Navalny was less guilty because he was developing a certain idea of civic nationalism. He indulged in trashy, xenophobic nationalism and then stepped out of it, having matured. But then he engaged in a project he consciously called civic nationalism. And that allowed him to put behind sort of ethnically disgraceful, ethnically exclusive language he was using before. And at the same time say, come on, we're Russia and we can do a lot better than this nonsense. And that's indeed what he said in 2014. I think maybe even in the Sandwich interview, we've got to put behind us this revanchist imperialist nonsense, and look what it's done again now. And so back to this sentence, focusing on eliminating Russian nationalism as a political force once and for all. If this means in all its forms, this sentence is a mode of what I would call soft fascism. And that's the idea that you are intolerant of a human grouping by excluding them from moral categories to which you actually know that they ultimately belong. So let's back out of soft fascism and simply call out ambiguity here, right? If you mean eliminating all forms of nationalism, then that's the most depoliticized and insane position you can imagine, because how are the Russians going to appeal to an institution like the Russian army and point out that it's been engaged in evil in Ukraine? And by appealing to its sense of its better mission, right? So no way should this sentence be allowed. It should be absolutely allowed in print. We must never cancel anything. Always the answer is to an article you don't like, another article. But at the editing stage, this should have been clarified into, come on, Casey, what's the nationalism you have in mind here? And if you mean all, please say all. There's no problem with that. You'll be criticized for that, but no problem. Just clarify it, however. Ironically, the West's willingness to place all hopes on a single this is the third time we're talking about placing all hopes on a single individual figure, on a single conspicuous figure in Moscow, while turning the other way when the figure's imperialistic tendencies came to the fore. And this hardly began with Navalny, he is saying. Such a phenomenon can be traced all the way back to the late Soviet Union, and we'll skip the sentence, when the West was quite favorable to Mr. Gorbachev, and then there is a paragraph about Gorbachev policies portfolio, including achievements such as Glasnost and Perestroika. No, just Glasnost. was a sight better than that of any of his predecessors, but when Gorbachev forces slaughtered anti-regime protesters in places like Kazakhstan, Georgia, Lithuania, the West hardly blinked, embracing Gorbachev closer and closer, blah, 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 blah. Those movements, which the United States actively tried to tamp down, eventually toppled the Soviet Empire, catching Washington flat-footed and leaving Gorbachev as a man without a country. Yeah, I mean, Gorbachev has blood on his hands. Absolutely. However, how much blood on his hands does he have? I mean, virtually anybody else in his position would have kept the Soviet project going via violence, or at least tried to. And he largely didn't. So I do think Gorbachev has blood on his hands. And we touch on it. I think there's a Gorbachev video on the main channel. So it's really important to acknowledge that, but it's also important to contextualize it and point out that Gorbachev presided over a largely peaceful dissolution of the project he was trying to sustain, and that was quite historically remarkable, but blood on his hands without doubt. Under the Clinton administration, Washington followed the Soviet collapse by heaving its hopes on democratization in Russia, and understandably so. Yeltsin was amid the rubble a clear leader, and so on and so on. But Yeltsin's authoritarian nationalism roared to the fore. Not only did he shell the parliament and implement the super-presidential system that Putin later inherited, but he also refused to remove Russian troops from eastern Moldova and oversaw armed interference in northern Georgia, while he threatened to redraw Russia's borders with both Ukraine and Kazakhstan if the former colonies didn't follow Moscow's writ. And most notoriously, after Chechnya voted for independence from Moscow, Yeltsin launched a devastating campaign in 1994 to crush Chechen separatists, an invasion that he and Putin would reprise again toward the end of the decade, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. I don't have any comment to make about that. Yes, absolutely. All the while, US officials' criticism of Yeltsin was effectively non-existent. As one academic analysis of the era summed up, the Clinton administration saw no alternatives to Yeltsin and was prepared to support him no matter what. To be sure, there are yawning differences between Navalny and these predecessors, not least the fact that Navalny never came anywhere close to power. Yet there were unsettling similarities between them, which the West continually played down, but which in those current and former colonies alike are readily recognized. Navalny, for instance, was a clear Russian nationalist. Not only did he back Moscow's invasion of Georgia in a way describing Georgians as rodents, he also used additional ethnic slurs to describe others from the Caucasus. He further framed himself as someone who would remove non-white immigrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus by ruthlessly deporting them, as one journalist wrote in 2021. Most notoriously, Navalny spent years not only refusing to condemn Moscow's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but then dodging questions about whether Russia should return to return the Ukrainian region of Crimea to Kiev's control. So I do think this is actually a flagrant falsehood. Because Navalny immediately said that this was unacceptable and illegal, the annexation of Crimea. Navalny spent years not only refusing to condemn Moscow's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but then was dodging the question about its return, which he was. So fascinating. Why is this in? Is this in because it's a lie? And it's shocking how much we overestimate how much people lie, actually, because often one just ends up believing what one wants to believe. Well, let's read Robert Howarth's response to that falsehood. Error 1, he picks out 3 errors in Casey's piece. Robert says, Navalny did not spend years refusing to condemn Moscow's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. In fact, Navalny opposed the invasion loudly and repeatedly. As leader of the Party of Progress, he was behind a March 2 statement that condemned the invasion as contradicting Russia's interests and called for a halt to Russia's preparations for intervention. On March 12, he used his blog to explain his opposition to the invasion as a violation of Russia's international obligations under the Budapest Memorandum, and because the change of state borders in Europe, quote, with the use of force is unacceptable. Yeah, that word, unacceptable. In March 19th, he denounced Putin in the New York Times for resorting to, quote, imperialist annexation as, quote, a strategic choice to bolster his regime's survival. He also debunked Kremlin propaganda claims that Crimea was dear to Russian hearts. So compare that with Navalny spent years refusing to condemn Moscow's initial invasion. So there's an editing issue here, obviously, because that would not fly, should not fly, because it's a glaring factual error. And it's just embarrassing for someone to write that. Even if elected president, he said in 2014, he'd still retain Moscow's control. This is back to the article now. Control over Crimea. It was in early 2023, nearly a decade after Kremlin first barreled into Ukraine, that Navalny called for a restoration of Ukraine's 1991 borders. That shift was, of course, welcome, but the fact that it took a crushing war to get there, I'll skip the next few words, was a testament to how ingrained such revanchist views are, not only in Navalny, but even among his supporters. Well, let's see what Robert Horwath has to say about this. Now, you see, claiming that that's evidence of Navalny's revanchist views isn't a factual error anymore, because that's an interpretive view, so you can't just call it a factual error. But Robert Horwath calls it error too. The claim that Navalny's interview, where he said that Crimea would not be quickly returned to Ukraine, was evidence of revanchist views, is that second error. Navalny's actual position was that the invasion created a political problem, like Cyprus and Kosovo, that would not be easily solved. Navalny's anti-revanchist position is obvious in the same interview, where he states, quote, "There is nothing more damaging to the interests of the Russian people than this imperialist chauvinism. It is not in the interests of Russians to be engaged in seizing neighboring republics. It is in the interests of Russians," Navalny goes on, "to fight corruption and the struggle with alcoholism and other issues, etc., etc. The resolution of internal problems. It is in the interests of Russians to make sure that the still colossal oil rent is working for Russians." So basically, these are quotes that Robert Horwath is advancing in support of the idea that the interview with the sandwich isn't real strong evidence of Navalny's revanchist views. But this is an interpretive disagreement here now. This is not in the realm of factual debunking. I do think that there are some elements of imperialist thought in most of the Russian opposition and in Navalny, but they manifest themselves not in "here we go and we were borderless and we're going to seize territories," but in that business of not having an alternative. Because actually, when you come out of imperialism properly, what you do is you generate a vision of an alternative. So it's not so the problem with imperialism among the Russian opposition is primarily not that they have explicit imperialist views, but that they've come out of imperialism and not stepped into anything else. And that still is a way of existing under an imperialist shadow, I'm afraid. So you see, that's a much more illuminating objection than the sort of thing Casey Michel is advancing here. So let's carry on. And the fact that so many in the West willingly overlooked such retrograde views is hardly a testament to Western policymakers' willingness to wrestle with just how deep Russian nationalism truly runs. Well, again, that is completely unacceptable because it lacks clarity. Now, are you referring to the kind of nationalism which is ugly stuff Navalny said for a few years in the the first decade of this century? Yes, obviously. Are you referring to the interview in 2014 where he talked about the sandwich, not giving Ukraine back straight away? Yeah, obviously. What other kinds of nationalism are you talking about? So you could argue that the examples that Casey Michel has given suggest that he is talking about malign forms of nationalism. But I don't get the indication that that distinction is at all at work here between benign and malign forms of nationalism. You see? And that just removes the piece, as it were, from being a meaningful contribution to the debate. With Navalny's death, an opportunity has opened for the West to finally move beyond the idea that a particular political... How many times are we going to say that? That a particular political figure is this the third or the fourth time we're there? Can lead Moscow out of its imperialistic delusions and into a democratic future. It's a tragedy that it's taken Navalny's death to open this possibility, but it is a possibility that the West cannot afford to pass yet again. So what should the West do then, practically? Let's put this another way. There is no Russian Mandela coming, and even if we continue to refuse to tackle the issues of Russian nationalism head on, this is a meaningless sentence in the context of this article, I'm afraid. Even among those who are opposed to Putin, then we risk seeing even a post-Putin Russia return to an imperialist footing, tossing Europe into catastrophe once more. Benign versus malign nationalism distinction, please. Sorry, otherwise the article doesn't have a meaning. Which is why, in this post-Navalny world, the West must focus on snuffing out Russian nationalism wherever it is. Soft fascism, I'm afraid. This means elevating the insights and advice from former Russian colonies, such as Kiev, even more. After all, it is those former colonies that proved more prescient about Russia than policymakers in places such as Washington and Berlin over here, about the threat of Russian, borderless Russian imperialist mania, of course. But about how to instigate change in Russia? No. There's a deep crisis of depoliticization. It's global. It affects Ukraine too, which is why Ukraine is having such a big problem about its conversation with its future. About its future is not as big a problem as the problem Russia is having, obviously. But the idea that we're getting any meaningful proposals for politicization of the Russian space from Eastern Europe is not real. These ideas are not coming, I'm afraid, from the Russian opposition either. And they half came from Navalny. Navalny did the politicization, but not the offering of an alternative. Too many of Navalny's offers of an alternative, including his serious transformation into an advocate of a more parliamentary and less presidential system. So funnily enough, what Casey Michel is talking about here is exactly what Navalny has been raving on about for at least, perhaps half a decade. Because Navalny has been saying exactly that you can't have a single person come in, which is why we need to forget about the, obscene verticality of our system and elaborate a parliamentary democracy. This means recognizing Russian irredentism as a phenomenon that extends far beyond Putin's base. What is Putin's base? We just need more clarity about all of these points, I'm afraid. And one that has far more cachet among the Russian body politic than the West realizes. As a scholar Mark Galliotti recently noted in his podcast, even among the populace opposed to Russia's invasion in 2022, pretty much every single Russian for or against Putin thinks that Russia's initial annexation of Crimea in 2014 was okay. So, not pretty much every single one, but most, without doubt, thought it was kind of okay. And that's a sickness. And it's a sickness that is about an unwillingness to recognize where certain things end and other things begin. It's a kind of special pathology of unboundariness. But Navalny was condemning the annexation. And we need a benign and malign nationalism distinction, right? The story would run in Russia, presumably, come on, we're Russians, and we don't do this. We don't do this annexation of Crimea business. It's shameful. And this means, finally, moving beyond the idea that some singular... Casey, how many times am I going to mention this? That some singular figure will rally Russians to their cause and toss off the yoke and appeal of Russian expansionism once and for all. Not that the West shouldn't support anti-Putin opposition. As long as Putin remains in power, the war will continue, with the potential for far worse to come. But whenever Putin leaves office, the West cannot put all of its chips in a single reformer, especially if it means eliding the said reformers' nationalism and ignoring their previous support for Putin's invasions. It's a legacy that Navalny may well have been proud of. It's a legacy that will perhaps, for the first time, finally lead Western policymakers on the right path and at some point result in the democratic Russia that we all long to see. So there is a third objection from Robert Hovarth here, and it is this. The treatment of Navalny as an ethno-nationalist on the basis of statements from a very short period in 07-08, when he was trying to build an anti-Putin coalition of liberals and nationalists on the model of Ukraine's Orange Revolution. Let's have a look what more Robert says here. The reality is that Navalny evolved and his position on Russian nationalism changed. By 2011, he was exhorting the crowd at a radical nationalist rally to empathize with the plight of the inhabitants of the Muslim republics of the Russian Caucasus. By 2013, militant Russian nationalists had had enough and were declaring that Navalny had never been a nationalist, merely a liberal who used them. Navalny's opposition to Russian imperialism is clear from his call to his compatriots to demonstrate against Putin's full-scale war against Ukraine. Quote, "If, to prevent war, we need to fill up the jails and police vans, we will fill up the jails and police vans." It was reiterated by his call for the dispersal of power in a post-Putin Russia by the replacement of Putin's super-presidential regime with a parliamentary system as the only way to stop the endless cycle of imperial authoritarianism. In his opposition to imperialism and his support for democracy, Navalny became a paragon of liberal nationalism. And Robert goes on to say what an important role liberal nationalism played in the democratization in the post-1989 Eastern and Central Europe. Horvath concludes, Casey's factual errors and his failure to grasp the divergent possibilities of nationalism leads him to an appalling conclusion. Quote, the West must focus on snuffing out Russian nationalism wherever it finds it. And Robert says, this is the crude genocidal language of Kremlin talk shows. I'm not actually comfortable entirely with that line from Robert. I don't think there's anything genocidal in that language. It's a bit ethnic cleansing-y, but it's not genocidal. Casey's the Kremlin's language is genocidal, though. Casey's incitement to hate. Yeah, that's so for me, I'm a little short on. I'm not quite there on calling Casey's article an incitement to hate. Is also a gift. It is. I have called it a sort of incitement into soft fascism. But, Casey's incitement to hate is a gift to Kremlin propagandists who are desperate to show that the West is seeking to destroy not merely Putin's dictatorship, but Russian culture as such. Expect his words to be quoted repeatedly by Moscow's war propagandists. Okay, so the most interesting thing about this article we have read is that it is very depoliticized. It is a little performatively moral. It's a moral article that's a bit performative, more than it is a political article. And it rather presents Navalny as a toy or a bit of candy we might buy or not buy, like or not like. But nobody, as I've said many times before, is offering Navalny as that. Navalny is a project on the Russian space. We don't have to like it. We're not Russian. But even if we were, still nobody's offering even Russians to vote for Navalny as their president. It's just a political project. Was Navalny a likable person? Yes, he actually was. Would I have enjoyed voting for Navalny if he were my political representative here in Tower Hamlets in East London? No. But that's an absurd sort of transposition of persons and historical contexts. Navalny's chief fault, if you like, was that he was insufficiently reflective about the West. That Navalny had magical thinking about transposing something like a Western politics onto Russia at a time when Western politics is sliding backwards in the West itself. And of course, at a time, well, it's always been that kind of time when Western politics is very diverse and very complex. You can't just say you like it. What are you going to take from it and how and why, right? So it's that story about the beautiful Russia of the future being a kind of copy of the civilized West that is, in my opinion, a position that is still in the shadow of Russian imperialism, because it's a position that has stepped its way out of Russian imperialism but has not sufficiently stepped into something further. So that's my 2 cents on this. But the biggest takeaways today are about the fact that this is a somewhat performative ethical article that doesn't have enough politics in it, and about the importance of patriotism and various kinds of benign nationalism when we think about making our own countries go better. Lots of love. Talk soon.